Hi everyone, today I'm going to be interviewing Machiko, who is a software engineer at Compiler. Recently, she became a member on the advisory council for Boundless Brilliance. She originally went into journalism before her passions led her into the STEM field. She thinks that being curious about the world around you and learning about lots of different topics is a valuable trait. So let's go learn about her STEM journey.
Hi, my name is Machiko Yasuda, and I am a software engineer at a small women-owned consultancy called Compiler, which builds open source software for governments.
How did you find out about Boundless Brilliance?
I learned about Boundless Brilliance through Dr. Amanda Zellmer at Occidental College, and I learned about her lab from the Arroyo Foothills Conservancy, which does research around where I live in Altadena.
Why did you decide to get involved with Boundless Brilliance?
So for the past 10 years or more, I've been involved in efforts to teach more people, especially women or people who are from a non-STEM background, skills like web development or GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems, and things like that. I've also taught bicycling. And so I'm interested in all sorts of efforts of kind of community learning, especially for kind of underrepresented people who haven't done STEM before. And I really felt that Boundless Brilliance's goals of bringing STEM to women or girls at LAUSD schools was really up my alley. And so that's why I wanted to join. I also wanted to meet people from different parts of sort of the STEM world locally who are also interested in that.
What kind of scientist are you?
I originally actually came from the journalism world. And so
Okay.
in some ways, I'm sort of like an untraditional scientist, but I work now currently in software engineering. And so I'm definitely on the technology and engineering side of things. And I also work for government agencies. Like currently, I work for Caltrans, which is the state's Department of Transportation. And so I'm very embedded in the world of both web development and software, and also kind of the civil side of things, like civil engineering, public transportation, civil services, and all that stuff.
So you started off in journalism and then moved into STEM. When did you get interested in working in STEM, and what did that transition look like for you?
So I could definitely say that from when I was in high school through college, I didn't think I was interested in STEM. I really didn't think that the categories of things I was interested in STEM. But actually, if I think back to it, I was always interested in STEM because I was very passionate about learning about environmentalism and the environment. That was always something that interested me. I did environmental science AP in high school, and I really liked that class. And I think for some reason, like I didn't even think that it was STEM because I felt like I was just learning about my local environment and like the history of where I lived. I remember when I was in high school, I learned that there was a Superfund site near where I was growing up, which is still a big issue where there's DDT that was like leaked into the ocean next to where I grew up. And so these were issues that I was really interested in, but I definitely never thought of it as like STEM necessarily. All throughout high school and college, I also was really interested in the internet and the web, but I also didn't think that that was part of STEM. And I started working at the Daily Bruin, which was my college newspaper when I was in college. And part of the reason was because I wanted to work on the website. And I also wanted to learn how to do things like make maps or make charts, which now we call that, data visualization or data science. But at the time, I also didn't really think that that interest was also part of like the STEM category. And so I was just pursuing sort of journalism, and I was also learning foreign languages like Spanish. And that was one of my sort of specialties in college, was also very much rooted in like, I wanted to be able to talk to the people that live in LA, which for a lot of us is learning Spanish. And so I had all these sort of disparate interests, like, like this environmentalism thing, and also web and data visualizations and mapping. But I didn't really think of all those things as STEM. But once I started working in journalism full time, I really realized that a lot of the big issues that my colleagues and I were covering in the newspaper were very much related to science, technology, math, a lot of math actually, because I graduated right after the 2008 financial crisis. So we were doing all sorts of things in Excel, and we, like, a lot of my reporter colleagues were realizing that we weren't good enough at math. Like, we needed to go back and learn math so that we can analyze, collateral debt obligations and all these kind of financial things, which is a lot of it is math and economics. So I think that I realized that I can't avoid STEM in my life. Like, I'm just going to have to tackle it head on and just start learning it. And I can't avoid it any longer. It was like the summer of 2013 was when I decided that I would switch from kind of doing journalism full time into doing web development. And it really was a transition, because I started doing more web projects and web tickets at my journalism job. And thankfully, I had a few mentors at my work who were doing software full time for the radio station I was working at. And they kind of showed me, what was the software I had to download on my computer, what was the GIS software I needed. And they told me about programs I should be learning, or going to free workshops. And I went to a free workshop called Rails Girls, which was for young adult women who wanted to learn web development. And that was sort of my first day of like, wow, like I can do command line, I can deploy a web application, and this was fun. And that was 2013, and now it's been, I don't know, almost 10 years of working in programming.
I think it's interesting that in our minds, like, the category of STEM is pretty narrow. It's like, I tend to think it was just like a person doing research in a lab with like lab coat and like maybe like medicine, like doing surgeries on people. But STEM is like actually such a broad field, and there's so much diversity within STEM. So I think that's interesting that you didn't recognize that your interests were often aligned with like STEM categories for a while. Could you talk a little bit more about where you're working now?
So actually, I was just talking about how I went to this free coding workshop for women, and that was where I met one of my now bosses named Vicky, who also, like me, wanted to work sort of somewhere, in this space of like coding and web development, and also in local and civic government, and kind of trying to improve the way the government works with code and to help improve things in the world. And Vicky started a small consultancy that does software work for agencies like Caltrans. And so that's how I was able to get my job, which is pretty cool to me, because I really know that, we're coming from some kind of like similar interests in similar places. It was also really cool because when I met her at that workshop, we had both biked there, which is also kind of like an unusual thing to be biking in LA, especially as a woman. Yeah, so in my day-to-day job, not only am I, working with designers and product managers to come up with features for, web applications that are be used by different public transportation agencies, which can be similar for most kinds of software jobs. But in the civic tech world, you also have to be taking into consideration a lot more things that you wouldn't be doing at a corporation. We have to make sure that our site, when it gets launched, is available in Spanish. We have to also make sure that we are following all the major like federal privacy laws, accessibility standards, and also really making sure that our application is really working well with the frontline government agency workers, and making sure that there are always ways that a community member can get on the phone or go visit in person to do this thing that they might not be able to use the website for. And also part of my work is also kind of paying attention to really big like state legislation things that may be going on, or the state department's goals, making sure that what we're working on is aligning with all of those goals too. And so there is a little bit more of sort of politics involved as well.
What is your favorite project that you've worked on at this job?
My favorite project that I'm working on is the one that I'm working on right now, which involves making it easier for people to sign up for their transportation benefits. And when we say the term benefits, what that means is that if you are a senior or a veteran or a student, and you're using public transportation, you are entitled to discounts. Like let's say, usually a fare costs $1. If you're in one of those categories, it would be less, like maybe it's 75 cents or something else. And back in the day, I'm going to date myself. Back in the day, when I would take the bus, I would have to make sure that I always had like the exact change. Like not only did I have like $2 bills, but I need to have 3/4 or some combination of that to make sure I have 175, let's say. But the app that I'm working on allows people to just pay by tapping their debit card. And so you can tap it instead. So you don't have to go to the ATM to go get exact change, because usually on buses, you don't get change either. So you can't just give your bus driver like a $20 bill. You're not going to get that money back. And so a lot of what I'm working on recently is sort of at the intersection of all this new technological changes happening in the payments world, like contactless pay, and then also trying to align that with trying to make it easier for people who use public transportation to get their benefits.
And then what's the most rewarding part of your job?
At least for me, I could say that, when I was in college, or even when I was working in journalism, I never really thought that I could sort of like transition and keep changing and evolving in my career to the point where I actually am working sort of inside and with the government. I've also, throughout my time in LA, I've been involved in different transportation safety advocacy types of organizing as well. And even then, I never thought that I would finally be able to sort of like be part of public service. And so for me to be able to combine both my professional career and also with my sort of personal interests of making public transportation better and easier and kind of more robust in California is really exciting to me. Another sort of interesting side of the way that my company works is that we work in what's called open source. That means that, all of the code that we're building is available for everybody to see. And the way what we're building it is also kind of more all open. Like if you go to GitHub, you could see how we're building it. And it's a pretty cool way to be building software, because sometimes, a lot of things in STEM, not just software, can be very opaque. It's like you don't know how this lab is coming up with decisions. You don't know how the things that they've tried, you maybe know how much like money they got and when they delivered it, if they finally do. But the way we're building it is also different. And so that's exciting to me. And I worked at a lot of, startups where we worked on a project that ultimately failed. But in this case, I get to work on products and apps that people in California are actually going to be using. And that's very exciting.
What challenges have you faced in pursuing STEM, in making that transition, or in the previous companies that you did experience failure?
One thing I often think back on is that, after I finished college and kind of moved out and started my sort of adult life, there were a lot of different fields that I didn't feel like I was kind of part of, but I just jumped into. And I see a lot of parallels in that. Like I also was never super physically active or super like into exercise, especially like anything outdoors. Like I used to do dance, but that was about it. And once I finished college, I got really into rock climbing and outdoor bicycling. And I mean, that's scary. Like rock climbing outside is terrifying. And I think that kind of being able to sort of, and I would also say both of those fields can also be quite male and very technical and maybe not so beginner friendly always. But I would just constantly remind myself of like how much fun that activity was and kind of keep going that way. And then I think that just helped me bring like just some more confidence in myself. And I would always sort of, tell my friends or remind each other, like, like nobody can take away your past experiences. Like you just finished this like 100-mile bike ride, or you just did this like super hard rock climb that you never thought you could. No one else can take that away from you, no matter what they say to you at your work meeting, or no matter what they say to you on the street, or things like that. And that was just sort of this like habit that I started cultivating from that world. And the STEM world can be very difficult, especially when you're in the job hunting phase. I think that's when it could be the most kind of scary. There's so many tests and there's a lot of requirements. Some companies won't interview you unless you went to a certain school or things like this. And there's a lot of stuff like that. I think I also kind of got into the habit of trying to always be looking for, mentors or managers who are more diversity focused and who can see you beyond just your resume or beyond just your statistics. And cultivating that community has been important for me, even though it can be really kind of competitive in that job market world. I was able to sort of keep a level head and keep going.
Who is your biggest role model?
One of the books and kind of authors that I really liked when I first started getting into programming was one called Making Users Badass by Kathy Sierra. And I've never met her or anything like that, but I really like the way that she was able to like break down really complex topics into kind of like infographics and like really fun and easy kind of stories. And her book, it almost looks like a PowerPoint when you're reading it. Like it's mostly graphics and things like that. And it's also fun and interesting. And she faced like a lot of sort of online death threats and things like that back in the day for whatever reason. I don't know. And I remember when I was going to these free programming meetups, the people that I was learning from would say that their sort of role model was Kathy Sierra, and that was why I started reading her work. And I also learned from a piece that she wrote in Wired magazine that she was like a really early on skateboarder back in the 70s, before skateboarding went sort of corporate and pro. So before there were pro skaters. And she talked about how she and her friends would like to do this style of skateboarding, which was that they would skateboard down really steep hills with longboards. And that was their whole thing. And they would do like interesting tricks, like doing like a handstand on the skateboard. There's pictures of it online. And I thought that was so cool. And unfortunately, what ended up happening was that like kind of as skateboarding became more corporate and there were like sponsored skaters who were all male, that sort of culture got sort of wiped out, and what was interesting for me in reading Kathy's story was that it kind of really made me realize that whatever sort of niche that you're in, whether it's skateboarding, whether it's athletics, or whether it's programming, and I think she also did video game design, wherever that's in, I think it's possible to face kind of discrimination or just be outcasted if you're different in any way. But you can kind of keep moving past that and not let that kind of stop you. And that for me, it's been important for me to realize that, whatever fields I want to go into next, whether that's STEM or something totally different, it's up to people like me to make sure that we're making that space more inclusive for everybody else coming after you. And that's been kind of helping me keep going.
What advice would you give to people who want to become scientists?
My advice for you would be to always follow your curiosities, whether you think that is something that is sort of worthwhile or useful or commercially viable or anything like that. Especially when you're young, if you think, this one band is cool, or if you think this one style of dancing is really fun, or whatever it is, just keep pursuing that, because there's actually, if you really dig deep into it, there's sort of science and history and technology involved in a lot of different things, whatever it is. Like right now I'm getting really into like learning about native plants, native birds, which, for me, I always thought of myself as a history buff, a local history buff. But what I'm realizing is that history can also be science, because when you're learning about, geology or the history of the earth, that's quite scientific. And I would say to, don't take these categories too seriously, because once you get really deep into something, it's actually quite a mix of things. And, sometimes people might think that you are kind of unusual for being interested in so many things. People might say like, oh, I thought you were a STEM person. Why are you interested in theater? Or why are you interested in music? Or why are you interested in politics? I thought you were going to be a scientist, right? But I would say to you that it's better to be sort of this broad mix of everything and to try to kind of combine all your interests rather than to really put yourself in these categories.
Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to check out our other interviews linked in the description box down below. Bye everyone.